On this episode of Locked On Lightning, we're continuing our player reviews, and today we're taking a look at Brandon Hagel. Another stellar season, looking back on the trade 2 years later, and expectations for next season. All that coming up and more on Locked On Lightning.
You're Locked On Lightning, your daily podcast on the Tampa Bay Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
And welcome to another episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Adam Tanker. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Locked On Lightning. If you're watching this episode today, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We're also available on YouTube. And also, if you're watching this episode, that means this is episode 2 of today's 2-episode of player reviews. Earlier today, we did Darren Radish, and now we are moving on to Brandon Hagel. And today we're going to talk about another stellar year for Brandon Hagel, as well as looking back on that trade the Lightning made 2 years ago for him to bring him to Tampa Bay from Chicago. And that's going to be an interesting conversation to be had, because I'm going to start off real quick and said that I think it might be one of the best trades the Lightning have ever made in franchise history. We're going to talk about that. So starting off, looking back on Brandon Hagel's season, it was one of those seasons. I mean, Brandon Hagel. Let me start off real quick by saying that the last 2 years, watching, well, the last 2.5, if you want to count the 22 games he played in 21-22, were really just a treat to watch. To see Hagel, who's still very young in his NHL career. He came here when he was 23 from Chicago. Like I said, only played 22 games here. In those 22 games in Tampa Bay, he scored 4 goals and had 7 points. The following season in 22-23, he played 81 games, 30 goals, 64 points, which were all career highs for him at that point in his career. And then this past season, he goes out, plays 82 games, career high, as well as scores 26 goals, a little bit of a step back, not a big deal. 4 goals off his career high. So, right on track for kind of around those numbers, which is good to see. And then finish the season with 75 points, a career high. So, really, in summation, just you're continuing to see development from this young player. There's still very raw talent that the Lightning were able to acquire 2 years ago at the trade deadline back in March of 2022. And it really is just one of those things where, for as much flack as we give Julian Bruce-Boss here on Locked On Lightning, I still think that we got to give him his flowers when it's due. I mean, I know we all kill him for the Tanner Jeannot trade, which Tanner Jeannot is a very good player. I think he's going to play phenomenal as we kind of round out the rest of this team and the remaining pieces are brought forward. But, outside of that, I think he has done a very good job with this team, especially this Brandon Hagel. I know, especially with the Brandon Hagel trade. I mean, we talk a lot about Nick Paul. We talk about how big of a difference that has been to the Lightning's lineup since Paul has been here in Tampa Bay. But, now you throw Brandon Hagel, a guy who really still very much, like I said, a very raw talent in the NHL, a guy who could clearly score 30 goals a season, or is going to be that guy who could score 30 goals a season. I mean, to get that for what the Lightning gave up, and like I said, we'll talk about that in the second half, it's a monumental move that not only sets the Lightning up for the next 2-3 years in terms of, because like I said, I don't think this guy has hit his prime just yet. It sets the Lightning up for the next 10-15 years, possibly, if Hagel does stay that long here in Tampa Bay. But what I will comment on right now is that what he has done, the the extra layer that he has brought to this Tampa Bay Lightning team really can't be overstated, especially in this NHL where even though we talk all the time how there's really a huge amount of offense to go around, at the same time, just because there's a lot of players out there that are up for grabs that can score goals and put up points doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be a good fit for your team. But from day one, really, Brandon Hagel came into the lineup. Obviously, was playing on the third line for a little bit, moved up to the second line. This year, we saw him majority of the time on the first. And like I said, him playing alongside Point and Cooch, especially at the beginning of the year, and to see the things that those three players really can do for each other on the ice is great. And it really shows, a guy, like I said, who could very well for his entire career score or average close to 30 goals per year. For him to kind of, because you see what a lot of young players, sometimes they try to go for it on every shift, on every shot. Hagel shows a lot of poise. He shows a lot of patience for a guy, like I said, who still in his mid-20s, who's still developing. And for him to come in, and, that also speaks to the leadership in the locker room. But for a guy to come in who played very well in Chicago, to come in and kind of take a back seat almost at certain cases to Nikita Kucherov and Braden Point, really shows the maturity level of this guy. And on top of that, kind of another storyline there that, I think we spoke about this last offseason or maybe the season before, how really, I'm sure there were some people there that, whether it had been coming out of 21, 22, there was probably a lot of people after kind of seeing him I wouldn't say struggle because that's probably not the right word to put it, because 22 games, especially in a new environment at 23 years old, doesn't really give you a lot of times to kind of figure things out and get acclimated. But especially when you're trying to figure out your role in on a team such as the Tampa Bay Lightning, who proven track record of winning every game is a big game for them, and the aspirations they have. A lot of people were talking about, and that was a storyline, believe it or not, if you remember it or not, how when he came from Chicago and he kind of struggled for a little bit, and we talked about it that offseason, how really the thing that was interesting to see was how is he going to develop over the course of the couple of years, because, he had a little bit more help here in Tampa Bay, but a lot of people at the time, whether it had been from Chicago or from Tampa Bay, were contributing his success due to the fact that he was playing with Patrick Kane. And Alex DeBrincat. And I think that I think maybe I wouldn't be surprised if we spoke to Brandon at some point, and if he ever comes on the show, and I hope he does, we'll definitely ask him that question. I guarantee him, it was probably in the back of his mind at some point, if he paid attention to the noise, if, maybe that was a motivation for him, to come to Tampa Bay, prove that, Patrick Kane, yes, as talented as the future Hall of Famer was in Chicago, it wasn't just him that was helping me put up the numbers. I also have talent that I bring to the table that I can show here in Tampa Bay. And yes, he did, like I said, he went from Patrick Kane, who was kind of on the tail end of his career, Alex DeBrincat, who also another player who's still very raw and early in his career, to Tampa Bay with Braden Point, Nikita Kucherov, Steven Stamkos. I mean, really, you can't compare the two rosters. The Lightning are way more stacked than the Blackhawks at this point in time, and even at that point in time. And like I said, the maturity level off the charts to be able to come into the room and kind of just roll with the punches, especially after having a full off season to just kind of get acclimated in not only Tampa Bay, but just, with some of the guys on the team and all the guys on the team, really. So listen, I love to see this growth. We talk about it here a lot on Locked On Lightning, how really one of our favorite things to see here is guys really just growing from season to season and seeing them, even if it's a steady improvement, or a very slight improvement, it makes a whole world of difference from season to season, especially for the team as a whole. And, it really helps not only the team, but the GM really exercise their options quite a bit. I mean, we saw that Cooper was not afraid to move him around here and there. And that really shows you the trust there as well with Brandon Hagel on the ice for the Tampa Bay Lightning. So let me know in the comments below. I mean, what's your favorite part of Brandon Hagel's game? Because we kind of saw it all this season. We saw the scoring. We saw the facilitating. We saw the grit. This year, he really took a huge step forward, I think, with his physical play. We saw him fight a couple of times. Some fights were more exciting than others. I really don't want to see him fight as often, but maybe couple of times a year, that's fine. But definitely not a couple of times a week. So let me know in the comments below what's your favorite part from Brandon Hagel's season. And coming up in just a little bit, we're going to talk about that trade that was made a couple of years ago with Chicago Blackhawks, who won that trade, just, exploring all the dynamics of that trade and really talking about really what it means to the Tampa Bay Lightning even 2 years later now. We'll talk about that coming up. But first, we're going to talk about our first sponsor on today's show, and that is our friends and one of our favorite sponsors over at the Game Time app. Now, Game Time has these last minute killer deals, all in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. I love their flash deals. I love their zone deals, but I love the last minute deals where you could save up to 60% off buying last minute tickets for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, etc. I used Game Time about, I think it was like 4 months ago. Buddy and I, we had nothing to do on a Friday night, and we saw the comedian Mark Norman was in our neighborhood. We looked at the tickets. They were affordable. Boom, we were there 20 minutes later. And we were sitting pretty close to the orchestra there at the Beacon Theater. And it was all because of Game Time. And, you can't go wrong with that. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use Locked On NHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDON NHL. $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. So as always, I want to thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We're also available on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel there. And like I said, I always thank you guys for being our first listen of the day, because I know you guys are all diehard Locked On Lightning fans. But if you really are a diehard Locked On Lightning fan, you'll know that this was the second episode we put out today. A little earlier on today, we had a player review on one of our other favorite players on this team, and that's Darren Radish. Darren Radish, I love doing these. Like I said, I wanted to do some of these guys that maybe don't get enough credit during the season when we talk about the Tampa Bay Lightning and the success that they are having at any given time. So I want to do those guys first, talk about them, really give them their due diligence and their flowers for the season, and then we wrap up the player review process with some of the bigger names. The Steven Stamkos, of course. I think he's going to be the last one, because I think part of it we're also kind of saving to see what happens with that whole deal with the free agencies and the contract and all that, because it's just, like I said, every day that passes and we don't have a contract renewal from Stamkos, it makes me a little bit more nervous about the chances of him coming back to Tampa Bay. But right now, we're going to focus on some good things. We're going to focus on Brandon Hagel. We're going to focus on, in my opinion, one of the, if not the best trade in franchise history. A lot of people, I had to go back to look at some of the trades that the Lightning made, and the general consensus and I don't remember it quite as well. I think I was 12 when it happened. So, this was over 20 years ago. So I don't remember. But it was the trade that a lot of Lightning fans consider to be one of the best trades in franchise history. And that was for Brian Boyle from the Florida Panthers, who was a huge part of that 2004 Stanley Cup team. And really went on to be a very good player for the Tampa Bay Lightning, as well as, went on to other teams in the NHL. I believe he played for the Sharks. I know he played for the Rangers at one point. Got to see him quite a bit up here in New York. But I think when we look at the Brandon Hagel trade, there's a lot of moving components to it. I think I don't think at the time we could say that it was a deal that really needed to be made. I know the Lightning were obviously looking. You're always looking for more scoring. But I think a lot of people didn't know, including myself, how well this was going to work out in the Lightning's favor. So just to recap it, the Lightning traded Taylor Radish, Boris Tkachuk, a 2023 first round pick, a conditional, 2024 conditional first round pick, and then the result of that was the Chicago Blackhawks also received. So they ended up receiving the 2023 first round pick, and the 2024 for this year first round pick. The Lightning in return got Brandon Hagel, as well as a 2022 fourth round pick, which turned into Kenny Connors, and a 2024 fourth round pick, which ended up coming out to the 99th overall pick in this year's draft. And I have to say, at the time, I think some people were hesitant about that deal. We were very familiar at the time with Bo Tkachuk. I really liked at the time how well he was playing at the NHL level, even though it was very limited. But there was a lot of good things we were hearing about Bo Tkachuk coming out of Syracuse as a really, one of the future faces of this Lightning franchise group. Taylor Radish, I think, was still kind of a little bit more of an unknown. We were a little bit more familiar with Darren, of course, who like I said, we did an episode about him early on today. But at the end of the day, you look at this deal and you look at where the Blackhawks are and you look at where the Lightning are, say what you want about the recent success or maybe the lack thereof, the recent success that the Lightning have had over the last 2 years. Obviously, both of those being first round eliminations in the playoffs. To go out and get a guy who could score, possibly. I mean, like I said, very raw still very much in the midst of developing into a polished NHL level player. But the fact that he's playing second line and first line minutes with some of the best wingers in the NHL, with the best forwards in the NHL, and on top of that, like I said, can score 30 goals, can get up to 70 plus points, goes out there and can throw hands and throws weight around when he needs to be doing it. To get that for really still, 2 players and a couple of picks, while the Lightning are in the midst of still having a team that can compete, where they're really just a couple of pieces away from a cup. I mean, that's the only thing you're falling short of is actually winning a cup. That constitutes, I think, definitely one of the best picks in Lightning history. Now, obviously, if the Lightning go on to win the cup in the next couple of years, or eventually do win the cup, at least during Hagel's time here in Tampa Bay, we would have to throw it up there as one of the best. I mean, Hagel, like I said, it's very hard, even though we talk about it all the time, how good the offense around the NHL has gotten over the last 5 years. And it's really turned into a scorer's league now. There's still, there's always that chance when you're bringing in a scorer that it's just not going to work out. You've seen it certain parts of the NHL with Patrick Laine up in Winnipeg. We saw it with Johnny Gaudreau in Columbus right now. I mean, he's not the all-perennial scorer. I mean, one of the bigger names, Jonathan Huberdeau, went from an MVP trophy winner to just in the middle of a no man's land out in Calgary. There are instances where it just doesn't work out. But so far, over the last two and a half years with Brandon Hagel, it's really worked out. And I'm not going to sit here and proclaim that Hagel's going to be he's not going to be a Hart Trophy winner or anything like that. I don't think he's there just yet. Maybe once he gets towards his around like 28 and he continues to develop, maybe we could start having that conversation. But maybe eventually next year, if we continue to have the conversation, about him developing and doing all the things he did right this year. The conversation could be had as him being a top 10 Selke Trophy player. We just got done the other day talking about Selke Trophy winners or future Selke Trophy winners and Anthony Cirelli. And I was talking to someone the other day about, they're a hockey fan, but they weren't entirely sure, they basically asked me, why is a Selke Trophy such a big deal? And I said, because it really is a good measuring stick. Because, there's always talk about forwards, especially. This guy could do this. He could do that. He could score. He could play defense. I think really the Selke Trophy is probably the closest thing to affirming that a forward has really he's taken this step to where he's gone from a good player, a very good player, to being an elite player. And because, like I said, in today's NHL, this is probably one of the most overpowered scoring eras that we have ever seen since probably like the 80s and 90s. But the last 5 years scoring has really exploded. And I think, to have a forward who could not only score, but could do a lot of other things, I mean, that's huge. We see it in the playoffs every year. We saw it with Florida in the series against the Lightning. They had a bunch of guys on that team that could not only score, but could just do a ton of other things. We saw it the other night, last night. I'm recording this on May 17th. We saw it last night if you watched the Ranger Hurricanes game. I mean, Chris Kreider, one of those guys who he's been in the league for years. He kind of did it the opposite way. He played physical. He had the speed. He had the tools to be that kind of two-way forward, and then scores a hat trick in the third period to help the Rangers advance to the Eastern Conference Finals. Never won a Selke Trophy, but what I'm saying is it's very important to have a guy like the Lightning have in Brandon Hagel to be able to play a two-way game, not to be one-dimensional, because all these top scorers, we see it every year. We've seen it with the Lightning as well. We saw it with Nikita Kucherov in the first round this year. Goes from scoring galore, and then you go into the playoffs, and bam, you get stonewalled, and then that's when you run into trouble. And sometimes, scoring is not the only answer. Sometimes you got to hit back, and having a guy like Brandon Hagel is really the thing that could potentially be the difference maker between losing in the first round and advancing past the first round. And so I look at this trade again with Chicago back in March of 2022, and really it's one of those trades where we're gonna look back on it probably every year for the rest of Brandon Hagel's career, as long as he's here in Tampa Bay, which I firmly believe he will be. We're gonna look back on it as possibly the greatest trade in Tampa Bay Lightning history. And of course, before we wrap up this segment, I just remembered I forgot to give my grade for Hagel for this season. So I'm going to give Hagel a grade of A- on the season, just because development, like I said, is a huge key here when we're talking about Brandon Hagel. Still very raw, and I still think he has not even remotely come close to his ceiling with the Tampa Bay Lightning or in his career. So coming up in just a little bit, we're going to wrap things up with our expectations for Brandon Hagel for 2024-25. But first, we're going to talk about our last sponsor of the day, and that is our friends over at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guarantee Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride or die every time, or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. So one last time, I want to thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We're also available on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel there. Drop a comment below. And so we're talking about expectations for next season for Brandon Hagel. And really, I think I've been doing a good job of really not overcomplicating the expectations, because I firmly believe with every player review we've done thus far here on the show, I think really the formula for a lot of these guys is to just stick to what you know, stick to what's worked for you in the past. I even said it with Eric Chernak, just go back to the basics. And I think, with Brandon Hagel, if he just goes out there, plays his game, and lets the points come to him, he's going to be just fine. And as to where he might play on this roster or in the lineup next year, that does play a role in maybe how many more points or how many less points he may have at the end of the next season. We've kind of already stated here on the show and kind of made it really the mantra that the first line should really be Point, Cirelli, and Kucherov. And I think for next season, Hagel is most likely going to be relegated to the second line or just stay on the second line, as he kind of was relegated later this season. And I still think it worked out pretty well for him. I would like to see really, maybe like Hagel, Stamkos, and Point. Hagel, Stamkos, and Paul. I'm not opposed also to the second line, maybe having a little bit grit to it. So I've seen this kind of thrown around as well, and I've kind of warmed up to the idea. If you had a Stamkos, Hagel, and Jeannot line, just because I'm still not sold that what we've seen from Tanner Jeannot the last couple of seasons is, that's what you're going to get for the rest of his tenure here. I don't believe that whatsoever. I firmly believe, I think, at the end of the day, what we saw from Jeannot in Nashville, that's what we're eventually going to get. He's, and we'll talk about this when we get to Tanner Jeannot's episode, but, he's had a little bit of a tough go of it, and the expectations coming in were obviously not his fault. I mean, really, the only way to constitute that trade would have been him scoring 50 goals. And that's obviously not something that's going to happen. But I think, you throw Jeannot on that line with Hagel and Stamkos. You add a big body. You add a guy who could play both ways. And you also kind of jumpstart him with having Stamkos playing down the middle. You play Hagel on the wing. You could also interchange those two guys, because I know that Jeannot, if he works at it, he could definitely play down the middle eventually. You could mold him into a center. Even if you don't firmly believe that that's a good position for him, I think, yes, he's better out on the wing. But at the end of the day, that's not something that I would be opposed to. So let me know in the comments below. I like talking about lineup changes and all that. It's one of the things I've really grown to love here on Locked On Lightning. As for statistics, I would say probably another 30-goal season. I would probably say the 75-point range is probably where he's going to be at, unless he gets some time, which he most well likely will be getting. He'll probably get some more time on the first line next year as well, because this team goes through peaks and valleys, and I think that John Cooper is not going to hesitate if things aren't going well to put Brandon Hagel on the first line at certain times. So let me know in the comments below how you feel about all of that, line combinations, predictions, or rather expectations for next season, as well as, how did you just feel about Brandon Hagel's season? And we'll be back on Monday. Who we're going to talk about, I'm not sure yet. You'll have to find out then. But in the meantime, that's been it for this episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Adam Danker. I'll talk to you in the next one.